happens. And we are live. Welcome to Oz Property Investors, where we have the big names and we have the big fun. Big names, big gains. Going on, boys? How are we?
Good, good, good. It's nice to catch up again. Thank you for inviting me, guys.
No, good to have you on the show, mate. We have Matija here from Analytics. He is the host, the guest, and Steve Palise from better co-host than Jeff, but I believe you're from Palise Property. How are you, mate?
Sometimes when I'm not traveling.
I actually didn't see that better co-host than Jeff. That's pretty cool.
This is going to be a big session. I'm excited, boys. Great to have you on board.
Yeah, I'm excited. This is finally one where it's not just someone selling a dream. It's like numbers, my forte. So I'm actually looking forward to asking some hard questions.
Yeah, let's go, boys. Let's go. Let's do it. What's first coming? Give me the first one. Give me the first one.
Yeah, the first one. Okay, well, let's just dive straight in. I think we're live on here. So if anyone has any questions, guys, we're going to go through some pretty interesting stuff. So what are we doing? Who have we got here? So we have Matija. I'm not going to try and pronounce your last name. I'm sorry, mate. He's the co-founder of Analytics, a PhD researcher and expert in property cycles. So you aren't going to want to miss this one. We're going to go through the hashtag platform because a big part of what today's session is all about is like why your brief dictates the data. Like I see it all the time. You guys, you've changed the game up, Matt. Everyone's like, great, just look at the data. Just look at the data. And they're like, wait, my brief's completely different to your brief and your brief's completely different to my brief. And they didn't think that the data would be any different. So that's why I wanted to have this conversation. And then we have the beautiful and amazing Steve Palise, the beard with the most, best-selling author. I actually have gone to, every time I go to the airport, I see Steve's book, Leading Commercial Property Strategist, one of the top guys in the commercial property space. So you can learn a boatload from him. And you just released a new book, didn't you, mate?
Third book in stores yesterday. So I'm done. I'm definitely done. No more writing books.
How long did it take you to write one, though? I want to ask.
I'll be honest. So first commercial book, I wrote word for word. So that was like 3 nights a week, 3 hours a night for about over a year and a half-ish. Second one, because I was published on the first one, you get what's called a ghostwriter. So they write, but you write it in dot points. So you write the book in dot points. That was probably about a third the time. So you can kind of do it in about 4 or 5 months of kind of a few night hours a week. But it's way easier to write in dot points because then someone comes back to you.
Does the publisher supply the ghostwriter or you have to actually pay for them?
No, so the publisher supplies it. But depending on what publisher you are, where you're at, like you might pay for the publisher, some don't. Some do like a buyback. So like they'll publish you if you buy 5,000 books from them from the get-go to cover their costs, etc. Or if you're big name for me, like me on the third, because I'm so successful, different story there. So it changes depending on your person, but it's good fun. It's just, as you guys know, you work the big day. Joe's got a little one now. The last thing you want to do is sit down for 3 hours writing a book.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard. I got one published as well, and it took me ages. And it's not easy. I like it. I like doing it. It's just that you finding time is difficult.
Is that published now?
My one, my one's been published.
What's the book?
Yeah, plug it.
It's very niche.
My one is not about property, by the way. So I got approached by a publisher to convert my PhD to a book, and it's like it's in the context of project management. It deals with the relationship between identity and anxiety. So it's completely something philosophical and psychological. That was my PhD was in that. So that's why.
Dr. Matt.
Dr. Matt.
My mum still can't believe it. She's not impressed.
That's right.
Anyway, Joe, regarding what you said, can I take it away? I think it's an important question or concept like brief and how data changes. I just want to talk about that a little. So everyone these days uses data or says, I'm a data-driven property investor or buyer's agent or everything like that. And I think that's good, but I think this term is being thrown loosely around because I don't think the data is actually used in an appropriate way. I always say, a hammer, a hammer has no intrinsic value without the carpenter, So essentially, everything is driven by the financial circumstances, the strategy, and the brief that the client develops. So we start off with an overarching strategy, like you say. I want to have 150K passive income in the next 10 years. And then you reverse engineer that back to the initial brief or purchase. And then you sort of determine loosely whether it's you're in acquisition phase or in consolidation phase, etc. So depending on which phase you're in, you would have different components of the brief. And that would inform the significance of metrics that you actually choose. Because, for example, let's say if you're investing under cash flow strategy, and Steve is an expert in this, you're interested more in notions such as yield, vacancy rates, etc. But if you're in the accumulation phase, or you're primarily investing in growth assets, then obviously yield might take, might be in the passenger seat, not as much as the growth factor such as supply and demand. Now, there are relationships, a correlation between metrics where yield also might be important, but it's not as significant. And the issue there usually arises if you place the same significance or the same weighting across all of the metrics that you're actually looking at, you're averaging results and increasing opportunity cost. Because if everything matters, it's like it's the same as if nothing matters. It's actually the same thing. And then you're producing average results, and the cost of average results is the fact that you're investing in inferior locations. And then the ramifications of that is that it takes you maybe 15 or 20 years to actually get to your goal, as opposed to 5, 7, or 10. So I think that's the most crucial aspect when it comes to data, because it does change appeal and face on the basis of what you're actually trying to achieve, and that's something that hasn't been really spoken about in the industry.
It's also why people can argue, different investors and buyers agents arguing they've got the right strategy, and they can actually both be right, and they can also both be wrong. It just comes out.
Very
and
good.
I'll put my hand up. I used to be one of those people that say, oh no, this is the data I look at. This is all you got to look at. And after talking with you, I was like, oh yeah, it actually does change on your price point, what your goals are. And I was sort of doing it logically, but not relating to the data. Like someone coming on a passive income of XYZ. Cool. Yeah. I know what yield I need to buy to get to XYZ. I wasn't really thinking, okay, the data I look at as well needs to change, which I was doing, but I wasn't verbalizing or thinking about it consciously. So this should be good.
Yeah. So I mean, so there's a couple of elements here. You have a difference in significance on the basis of your brief, but you also have different timestamps associated with all of the metrics. Some metrics are short-term, some metrics are mid-term, some metrics are long-term, depending on, how much data you have accumulated for each metric. The more data you have accumulated, the more of a trend you can extrapolate. When you can extrapolate a long-term trend, you can infer longer into the future. And now if your brief has multiple layers in a sense that, I need short-term returns, but also need long-term performance, the way you layer the information, the significance you assign will also be different. Now, there are no infinite permutations. There are probably 10 or 20 different variations of that. But yeah, that's very important. And I mean, what you sort of alluded to is usually people, when they're investing, they promote an area. For example, they say this area is a good investment. Let's say Townsville. Townsville is a good investment location. Or they come to me and they say, okay, mate, what do you think about Townsville? I go, for who? Because it is the individual this is what's fascinating to me. If the individual is investing, how can we divorce the individual from the research process? So Townsville might be a great investment opportunity for someone that wants to enter a hotspot, maximize return in 1 or 2 years. It will then subside, X, Y, Z, But it's not a good investment location for somebody who doesn't need to extract equity in the next 2 years and might be able to invest somewhere where it's a bit of a colder place or warm spot, etc. So, I think promoting areas is dangerous because unless it comes with a complete elaboration of, who this area is fitted for, suits, who it actually can be attached to, I guess, which brief and which financial circumstance. And that's
I also think it's kind of shifted in the way that the market's gone as well, right? Like going back in time, we were buying in South Australia, WA and Queensland 3 years ago, and we were buying $400,000 properties at a 6.5% yield. And then now they're $700,000, $800,000. But that ticks the brief. That's easy. That's an easy brief. Anyone can fit that brief because it's high yield, high growth, high cash flow. But the market's changed now. Now to buy into those markets, you have to be at the $800,000. And can that area actually afford to push the prices to $1 million? And the answer is probably not. Not in this cycle. It's going to take some time for them to build it up.
Absolutely. You know what? Sometimes we have to deal with what the market gives us. It's not that you will always be provided with an opportunity to find the next Perth. you know. But your job as a researcher, as a buyer's agent, or as an investor is to increase the probability of a particular outcome, which means that you need to find the best of what is available out there. So usually you will get people to come and say, okay, listen, can you find me the next berth to have 40% return in a year? And when you say potentially no, because the positions of the current markets are not there, they get disappointed and they think, okay, something is wrong with how you're approaching. Well, no, because, you know, depending on what time you enter and what states, which cycles they're at, it all depends what they're going to return. And sometimes we just have to deal with what the market gives us. You know, we're not going to get, in some instances, the 40% return, but we might get the 7% return, which is the highest, or, you know, the 5 percentile at the top. And that's what the market gives us, and that's what we take. So we need to find the best performers in what's currently available. But that doesn't mean it's always going to be the 40 or 50%, as you alluded to, correct?
Yeah. The way I like to put it is the goal is to buy the best property in the best location at the best price for your buyer brief. And that buyer brief dictates those three other things about what is the best price, what is the best location, what is the best asset, because it's you completely shape it. It's the way around though. It's hard.
I always juxtapose it with like shares. Like if a 65-year-old came and asked me what shares could I buy, I wouldn't say Bitcoin, even though it might actually have a index. That's right. Yeah. That's right. You're diversifying. You're doing nice. With a 21-year-old, cool. Let's put a bigger portion of our savings, not financial advice, to a certain like high risk one with high return. And this is where the brief comes in. So you happen with all investments as well.
So you're right. I mean, what I try to sort of instill into the mindsets of our members is always, you need to have a clear link between your brief, research methodology, and then asset selection. Now, not only do you need to have that in order to pick the best asset, but you can reverse engineer that. You can then understand why you bought in a particular location. If some of your circumstances change or your preferences change, you alter the brief, and then that alters everything else. So you need to have a coherent link to know why you got to a certain location. So for the buyers agents out there, that's paramount, because they need to explain their choices to their customers. It's not like, it's this location because I said so. You need to explain it. You need to connect all the dots together. And if you don't do that, this is where you make the wrong choices. Absolutely.
So true. Yeah. And the way it works, like it's like a circle, right? When you're hunting around for your next property, you've got to run your property strategy. You run then the property plan of, great, I'm going to go out and acquire that asset. Then you do your phase 1 of due diligence, phase 2, you go through the circle, and then you start all over again. That next property, great. I now need to redo my strategy, redo my property plan, because so much stuff has changed. You can't just have, great, this is my 30. I see people writing down on a piece of paper, like, this is my 30-year plan. It's like, dude, there's no way. Even with spreadsheets, I see like when I was 18, I got a financial advisor, and he gave me this massive 18-year plan. And I was like, oh yeah, no, but I'm going to go travel the world for 3 years at this point. And he's like, oh, well, no, none of this works, then just scrap it and throw it in the bin. Like, you have to reassess your portfolio and reassess your goals and reassess everything, because, you know, kids pop up and jobs change and all of that.
I try to usually reduce it to something very simple so the users can, you know, understand. So I usually ask them, okay, give me the answers to 4 questions. What is your budget? What is your investment time horizon? When do you plan to extract equity into the subsequent purchase? And that sort of coincides with the discussion about, you know, serviceability. And then what is your risk profile? Now, all those questions have different sub-questions to them, and you can elaborate them further. But once you construct a narrative out of those 4 questions, then you know how to layer the data, short-term, mid-term, and long-term, to adjust for what the answers are. And that's the best way. And that's why I'm saying, you know, the term hotspotting, I always said, nothing against Terry Ryder, but I'm saying hotspotting in general is a dangerous term, because, you know, a hotspot for me is not a hotspot for you. You know, like, you know, you speak about hotspots, as I always said, you know, it's not in my position to actually be investing there. So that's why it's important to answer those 4 questions. And those 4 questions relate to your current and future financial circumstances, so you actually know where to go into. And this is why, you know, usually people ask me, because metrics have a different significance and a different timestamp, we are not all investing in one location. Now, we do have crossovers when it comes to Australia, because we have, you know, 1,000 or 1,500 suburbs that are of investment potential. So we are bound to have some crossovers. But essentially, you always can find a suburb that suits you specifically and doesn't have to suit someone else, which actually disburdens you from this, you know, complete slugfest when you come into areas that everyone is talking about. Maybe that area is not suitable for you. And that all comes down to understanding, okay, which metric is significant and why. I always say to people, investing is a behavioral science. We need to understand how data points are reflecting, what kind of behavior they're reflecting on the ground. And when you connect everything into a relationship, you can understand what will happen in the future. And you connect that relationship with yourself and your circumstance. And that's why, usually people say, is hashtag a self-fulfilling prophecy? Well, not everyone will buy in the same location because you have an infinite number of not an infinite number, but a various number of briefs and financial circumstances. So they're all going to be looking for a different golden nugget, And when you approach it that way, it completely changes the game, but it places the onus of the individual to actually understand what they're looking for. So give you an example, so I'm not too abstract. Now, when it comes to property investment, it's all about prediction and anticipation. You need to understand what's going to happen next. And because property is an illiquid asset, meaning that it doesn't exchange hands on a regular basis, such as shares and crypto, because of legislative measures and just, the general consensus that we hold the property.
Agent fee, it's going to take 90 days, 60
everything
days.
like that. It doesn't, and when you haven't, so that's why, because it doesn't exchange hands regularly, it's not as volatile. So when you have an established or a discernible pattern or a trend, you can actually infer what is going to happen in the future. So if you have a 2-year trend, you can infer what's going to happen in the future 1 year. If you have a 5-year trend, you can discern what's going to happen in the future 2.5 years, because I allow for a bit of contingency. Because to give you an example, if you have a nosediving days on market trend that's severely nosediving or reducing, which means the demand is intensifying, for that trend to shift to an equilibrium or to start increasing, it will need substantial number of, years for that days on market to be completely above the trend to start pushing the line up, And that's the beauty of property investment. When you have trends established and you layer the data short-term, mid-term, long-term, you can with high probability discern what's going to happen and where you need to invest into.
Okay. So I want to take a step back when we were talking about crafting your brief, because I think that's probably the most important one for people to start off with. So basically those 4 options are going to give you approximately how many general briefs do you have? Do you have is it normally kind of like small, medium, large budget? Then is it short, medium, long-term plan? Then is it cash flow, negative, neutral, positive? Are they kind of the layers that fall out?
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. Now on the platform, we currently have 9 different variations, but those 9, I've given sort of 9 bands or 9 variations, which can be adjusted on the basis of nuances that you need, So regarding budget, you're right. Now, budget informs the metrics that you need to include. To give you an example, typical prices that are 550K and below, socioeconomics don't play a huge role in those bands. Why? Because you can see areas that are 350K in value, 400K in value that have increased by 100K in a decade. That have doubled in a decade. Not only that, when you're investing in those low price points, you're bound to be investing in areas that are disadvantaged socioeconomically. So this is why socioeconomics do not play a big role. However, socioeconomics play a phenomenal role when you're investing in 700K typical price and above. And I'll give you an example. I did research and I realized that for 700K typical price suburb to increase to 1.4 million, there is only 0.34% chance that an area with socioeconomic score of 1 or 2 out of 10, i.e. disadvantageous, will double in value from 700K. So there's minimal chance, less than 1%, which is why socioeconomics plays a dominant role there.
So are there areas out there that are valued at 700K that have an ersat of at one, can you explain what the ersat is? And then answer the question, is there's 700Ks out there, 800Ks out there with 1 as the metric?
Absolutely, there's heaps. So yeah, ersat is an index of socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage. It's produced by ABS. Now, when it comes to ersat itself, a lot of people say it's released through census. Now, ersat is a very stable metric because the notion of gentrification doesn't happen suddenly. It takes decades to happen. It usually happens at either end of the spectrum, either the lower end or the higher end. And we have that information published on the website. So now coming back to what you asked, yes, there's a multitude of areas that have a 700K typical value and an ersat of 1 and 2. Now you have to consider, okay, if I want to invest in this area, how much steam, if you will, that area has. And you can layer another additional 3 or 4 metrics to determine steam, but that's a crucial factor there. And what Steve has mentioned when you're filtering for different price bands. So usually the price bands that we have is 0 to 600K or 550 thereabouts, then 600 to 850 and 850 and above, and those different bands, not only do they have different metric layers, but they also have different values for those metrics. To give you an example, let's say the notion of affordability. Now, affordability is one of the most crucial macro factors that drives purchasing patterns, because I think disparity between median increase in wages and property price has been the biggest since 1970. So the gap is enormous, right, which means that inadvertently that drives the purchasing patterns, especially for the owner-occupier cohort, which is a 2 times larger cohort than the investor cohort. Now, the affordability index, however, shifts. And let's say we have it on our platform as years to own, i.e. how long does it take for a medium income household to pay off a mortgage within a particular suburb, So for price points that are 550K and below, a years to own index of 30 and below is genuine. It's something that you should look out for. But you can't expect to have an area that's 1.3 million with an ERSAT of 30, This is why the index sort of shifts, but it shifts to a particular band. Let's say if I'm filtering for areas that are 1.5 million typical value, I wouldn't go over an ERSAT of 45 or 48. Because
that's one of my questions, right? Like a Sydney house price, is $3 million for an actual physical house. I don't know what the median is and the typical value of it, but then there's no way people are earning, like there's a $600,000 house. There's no way that people are earning that much of a difference in income for that area. So does that become less valuable when you're going higher up, or?
Yeah, so when you're going higher up, you're usually going higher up with the socioeconomics and the medium income. Now, you're not keeping pace. You're not keeping pace, however, which means that there's more of a friction point when you get to a certain affordability index. But you do have a lot of areas. Yeah, you do have a lot of areas out there, which is why you have to cut it in slices or bands when it comes to data. You have to figure out what is the top band where it causes the most friction, which is then reflected in how the price grows over a certain number of years. Which is why, let's say, an index of 45 is genuine for a $1.2 million property, but it's too unaffordable for a 600K typical price area. And you have to slice them that way and assign different values to correspond to the price. So not only are metrics correlated with the brief, but in and of themselves, they have a relationship. So you need to adjust them and change them on the basis of budget that you're inserting, investment time horizon, etc. Now, one other example. So usually people who are investing long-term, I usually ask them, what is your risk profile? And that's a superfluous question, because if your investment time horizon is long-term, your risk profile should be inadvertently low. One is tied to the other. Because the more you go into the future, the more uncertainty you bring upon yourself. And the more uncertainty you bring upon yourself, it is your job as a researcher, buyer's agent, or an investor to eliminate unpredictability to increase the probability of an outcome, So if you're investing long-term, your risk profile should be inadvertently low. And what is risk, essentially? Risk is anything that stops you from generating what you want, whether it's cash flow growth. So those hurdles or impairments to your outcome. Whether it's industry centralization, exposure to negative environmental effects, hold periods, high renter-to-owner ratios, etc., etc. But you got to consider all of these things to minimize that, unpredictability down the track. So essentially, if your investment time horizon is long-term, your risk profile is low. Now, if you're investing short-term, your risk profile can be high because let's say, what's the Gladstones of the world? If I'm investing 1 or 2 years and I'm trying to maximize my growth in the next 2 years, well, I can expose myself to more risk, because within those 2 years, depending on where we are macroeconomically within a cycle, let's take Australia at the moment as it is now, we've seen a reduction in interest rates. I think there's a higher probability that liquidity will increase within the economy, whether it's this year or next year. It will follow the Fed, which is American Central Bank. So if the macroeconomic conditions are favorable, means there's more money pumped into the system, then you can actually absorb more risk because the economy is not tanking. So within the next 2 years that you're actually holding that asset, you will have a higher certainty that nothing bad would happen. But when macroeconomic conditions change, there's increase in interest rates, somebody's imposing tariffs to the goods that we're exporting, and especially if that town is exporting only those goods and purchasing patterns rely on incomes from that central industry, then you should be more cautious. So you should take into account, the macroeconomic conditions and the position that we are in to ascertain risk. But as you shorter your investment hold period, you can absorb more risk inadvertently.
Okay, that was a lot. There was a lot there. There's so much there. I don't know if I have any questions because I don't know.
I've got a bit of a curveball. It's probably sort of related to what we're talking about, but not really. Coastal or lifestyle areas. So obviously, the further you get away from the beach. So where I live in freshwater, Sydney. Houses on the beach, 10 to 20 mil. One street back, 6 mil. 3 streets back, 4 mil. 500 meters inland, 3 mil, 3.5 mil. What are your thoughts on kind of analyzing those ones? Because as someone who's potentially going to look for a principal place of residence here, with the investor mindset, you're like, oh, okay, what? Because the medium house price doesn't matter. Let's say the medium house price is 3.8 mil. That's not actually a reflection of the property you buy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, within that area, because it's aggregated. Yeah, that's right. Now it becomes a very nuanced purchase and a nuanced brief in the sense that, there's an analysis of an area on an aggregated suburb level, but then there's further analysis that has to be done past the suburb level on the street level. You do the same that for any other area, whether it's 550K in value or whether it's the freshwaters of the world, and you will pick the best streets and pockets. Now, it has to stack. Essentially, price growth depends on supply and demand, Now, those areas really are not investment potential areas, not saying that they're not good investments, but you don't have a lot of investors investing in, beachfront property because of, they want to grow their portfolio unless it's towards the end or it's not the first purchase.
And historically, last 10 years, they haven't performed as well as the rest of Sydney. Even though
that's right.
Big game saying, oh, look, they've gone up 3 mil, but percentage-wise, not so great.
Yeah, the cash on cash return might be phenomenal, but percentage-wise, it's not great. So now it comes down to pen and paper exercise. If you want to, 2% growth on a $3 million property is more than 10% growth on a 550K. So definitely the lifestyle or the appeal of the sub-suburb level plays an enormous role, because I know there are in some instances, in that instance as well, but there are sometimes 20% variations in normal suburbs, as in not those high value suburbs as well, depending on where you actually buy, which is where the buyer's agent comes into very handy. But when you're analyzing, I do everything as a funnel-like approach, and usually investment is a mathematical game in a sense that it all comes down to what return I'm going to be making, So you first determine on the suburb level the supply and demand dynamics and how that's going to project or allow for growth, if it will, and then you go further down to compound that growth to find the suburb, locations that are going to perform better than others, So lifestyle and obviously hold periods, for example, in the beachfront property will be 25 years, while for 3 streets down, it might be 17 or 12, People hold on to their assets much more there, which is why probably there's no supply there, I would assume. It is very rare that something comes on market, and then when it comes on market, it's inadvertently immediately a seller's market, because the seller can just ask whatever they want for it, because there's not a lot of comparable sales, I guess. So it's an analysis on a sub-suburb level, but for an everyday investor, it's important to go as close to the purchasing point as possible, and that in some instances is either suburb level, and then you go further down to the street level to actually analyze and see which ones are the best pockets, I would say. But I followed the adage of, you can buy a shit house in a great location and you still see growth, and you can buy a great house in a shit location and you see minimal growth. That's the usual general consensus. Now, it might vary. We're talking in general terms, but it might vary in consensus,
Well, I see that all the time where people are like, oh my gosh, I have to buy the nicest house on the best street. It's like if you bought in WA, in Victoria in 2022, you made a bit of a mistake. You shouldn't have been doing that. You should have been buying in WA in South Australia purely from an investment perspective. But I know that some people did, and that it was an investment, but it was also an emotional decision. But it's like, how do you choose the best market in the best location? So what are some of the those crucial components are those 4 things. Like, what are some of the core fundamental data points that every brief needs to look at? Like, is there like these are your must-haves, boom, do these suckers?
Yeah, so there are a few. When I divide them into macro and micro, now when I say macro, I just call them macro because they have to be considered in every instance. Now they're not, high level macro in the true sense of the word, but they just have to be considered. Now, when you're making a decision on a data set and you're looking at data to execute, you need to have a high data accuracy and certainty in what you're looking at. And the way we classify data accuracy, it's essentially related to the volume of sales. And everything in data, when you have larger volumes of sales, you can extrapolate.
What about population? You see population, right? You go to an area and they've got 150,000, or like, is that not enough to say, yep, that's good, I'm good?
No, absolutely not. Far from it. I mean, population in and of itself is probably a level 3 metric. Sorry,
I'm just gonna.
It's such a dumb Joe.
I'm just gonna get out of here. Yes. No, because people have the reason I say that is that people have no.
I know why you're asking.
Minimum 10,000 or 15,000 or 20,000 or 100,000, but that's not necessarily the right way to be thinking about it. How should we be thinking about it? Yeah.
I got your question, and I know why you asked it. Now, what I usually say to those people, I say, look at a data set and look at suburbs. Try to find suburbs with 5,000 population and see how they've grown in the past. Okay. As simple as that. Just it's like reading a book, finding letters in a book. Essentially, see if it's possible for a suburb that has 5,000 population to grow in value. Now you can consider population, but again, it's very important to understand if there's a higher correlation between population and growth, and that's not the case. So it doesn't mean that if you have higher population, inadvertently you'll see more growth. That's a fallacy. So you can consider the population as a risk factor, as a cherry on top, essentially, to put your mind at ease. We have to be very careful what kind of significance you assign to it, because using that example, there's a huge danger there. You might exclude phenomenal opportunities for yourself simply by looking at the population numbers. And this is why...
Is the premise of that statement normally, and I've always thought this, is when the bigger, obviously, the population, the more diverse the economy typically is going to be. In a 5,000 person town, they're going to be a sheep station, and that's it. Whereas when you get to 20,000, they've got a bit of agriculture and a bit of cattle as well. And then if you get to 30,000, they've got a little bit of tourism and blah, and it diversifies the economy a little bit that way.
Absolutely. So it is a premise that if it's a larger population, there's high diversification of industry potentially. However, you have that in smaller populations. Now, to give you an example, Perth GCC area has grown dramatically in the last 4 years. Now, in Queensland, it wasn't like that. It was the regional towns that have grown the most. So it doesn't always imply also different states have different spice, and different requirements. What I'm trying to say is that you shouldn't just assume that population will get you there. You should definitely, what you alluded to, Steve, you should definitely take account of industry diversification, because to me, that's one of the most important factors that I was consider at the onset after data accuracy.
I kind of cut you off there. It was, you had data confidence. So data confidence is the amount
data confidence and data accuracy. You don't want the data to be oscillating and changing from month to month or quarter to quarter dramatically. Today, you make a decision upon a market that has a 25 days on market. Next month, it has 150, and you go, shit, I didn't buy in an area that I thought I was.
This is. I went on real estate. I was chatting with Jeff about this. I'm like, looking on real estate. Look at this place. The days on market's 93. And the data set was in December. So it's like, oh, that was the Christmas period. What was it before? 30, 45, 30, 22, 22, 22. And it's like, oh, okay. It's all about the trend rather than the
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So you have the more volume you have, the more accuracy you have, the more you can establish trends that don't shift and oscillate from a month to month. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I do is I consider industry centralization, exposure to negative environmental effects, or risk component. Industry centralization, highly centralized industry town tend to have higher levels of volatility or price stagnation. Now, if you expose yourself to those towns, that means that your long-term averages might be lower. So you have to consider that. Now, it doesn't imply, so this is what I say to people, this is an insurance policy. It doesn't mean that because you're investing in a centralized industry town that you will not see growth. You have Newmans of the world, for example, in WA, that has seen 80% growth in 5 years and yet minus 50 in 10. Okay, so if somebody invested within that 5-year time frame, they would have made substantial amount of money. But if they exit at the right time, perfect, no problem. So sometimes it's very hard to time macroeconomic changes which will affect the industry in question, which is why I just buy an insurance policy and I say, okay, I don't want to be invested in towns that have above average inherent risk. And I classify risk, economic risk, environmental risk.
The third in terms of environmental, though, like let's talk about Townsville, for instance, right? One of the most booming markets, but it's heavily flood zone prone. Oh, by the way, if anyone has any comments, feel free to throw them in. This is so far the only comment that we have, which I think is fantastic. How do you tell if people are listening intensely? There's no comments. So if you guys are, one, listening intensely, and two, yeah, we have a lot of people on the stream, so I kind of expected more comments, but I was like, that nails it. But just that answer on Townsville, I guess there is a lot of flood zone prone areas. How does that kind of affect the capital?
Yeah, so that answer is sort of tainted by recency bias, in a sense that we experienced floods recently. So, but essentially it all comes down to where we classify it as insurance premiums. If you call an insurance and you ask them, and I mean, the floods do happen, and there are certain pockets within a suburb that are less and more exposed to flooding, and you can determine that. But it all depends how much it actually happens and does it really affect the purchasing pattern on the ground. And honestly, insurances have the best, they have a handle on that. You call an insurance agency and you ask them what is the premium on investing in Townsville, Cairns or some other areas, and you'll be able to see how much value they actually place on that risk. Now, in some instances, again, you don't have perfection. You never have perfection. You might be exposed to some increasing holding costs. But the question is, okay, how much exposure am I willing to adopt and have? There are certain, as I said, parts, if you do flood and bushfire overlays, you'll see some pockets that are less exposed, some that are more. Now, it might happen that you'll be affected by it once, but overall, as an insurance policy, Townsville doesn't have too high of a premiums as we would thought because of the recent events, So now, when it comes to environmental risk, what's important there is we have to consider that growth happens from competition, and we need two cohorts participating and competing in the market. We owner-occupier cohort and investor cohort. Now we have to remember that the 2 times larger borrowing cohort is the owner-occupier cohort. So even though there are floods happening in Townsville, there's people going to still buying owner-occupier homes because they actually live there. So now the environmental effects, why they're disadvantageous, and I'm talking about the end extreme, the really extremely affected areas, which are sort of exclude, and why are they not beneficial for my research is because investors, firstly, they don't respond well to high holding costs. And if you diminish the participation just a little by one by one cohort that's buying property, which is investors, you're sort of minimizing the competition in a particular area. So when I research, I always cast a wider net. I don't set too rigid filters and scores to make sure I get the best of everything, because you're not going to be able to do that. Perfection doesn't exist. So even if you go and say, I want no exposure for flooding, I want very high industry centralization, you're going to get 0 results.
Yeah. Because
perfection doesn't exist. You're looking at areas from 30, 40, 50, 100 domains. You're not going to find an area that has perfection in all the domains. So that's why you cast a bit of a wider net, which is why I go with averages. Essentially I say I want below average risk. Am I still exposed to some risk? Yes, but I've eliminated 50% of the locations, casting a wider net. And then if I go further in comparison and refining it, I might assign to some metrics higher weighting. If I place an onus on flooding and risk, I might assign it with a higher weighting. So those that have less risk are pushed to the forefront. That's why there's like 2 steps in. There's shortlisting and filtering, eliminating noise, including what you must have in order for something to happen. And then there's further refinement in the detailed comparison.
So where are the common mistakes for people? Like where do you see people messing up when it comes to selecting or making their property brief?
Well, the first common mistake is to not consider it. The second mistake.
Yeah, my broker says I've got $800,000 or $1.2 million. I'm just going to go I'm just going to spend that.
Not even that, Joe. People like us, the buyer's agent has a bias, and they say, "Oh, cool. Well, you need to target 500K properties. They grow the most." That's it. And I'll hands up. That was me 7-8 years ago. You have a preconceived notion of affordability is key, and by affordability, I meant cheap price, not actual affordability in my head. And you're like, "Oh, let's go buy the 300K houses in Logan. Let's do that."
Yeah.
And like, luckily they've grown, but that was the bias I had.
Yeah. Yeah, spot on, Steve. Now, the bias is one other thing that shapes your decision making. And again, one of these biases is population. Another bias that people usually have is, let's say they do develop their brief and they say, well, if an area has grown 50% in the last 5 years, I don't want to invest in it.
Yeah.
Now, what are you? Sorry.
That's the rule, right? Like 50%.
That's the rule. You can't invest in an area that's growing 50% in 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I say, okay, I note what you're trying to say. You want to do counter-cyclical investing. I understand what you're doing. However, what are the current supply and demand dynamics on the ground within that suburbs that are growing 50%? And then if we look at Townsville has grown 80 or 90% in the last 9 years, which means that Townsville would have been eliminated 1 or 2 years ago as a potential investment location, and people have made 40% in the last 2 years annually, nearly, So it all depends, again, on your timeframes. Yes, the area has grown 50% in the last 5 years, okay? But how about we first consider, okay, what's its performance going to be in the short to midterm? Does it have any more steam left? And then what are its long-term indicators? You have those areas that have grown substantially and have continued to grow that defy essentially logic. So I guess the danger is
that in like WA right now. Are you seeing that there's areas that are starting to be on the not defying logic, but getting to that point of like, yeah, this doesn't even make any sense anymore?
Yeah, so I haven't looked at a WA recently, but I think the difference between those that defy logic and those that don't is the affordability question. So
it's interesting that you haven't done a bit of a deep dive into WA. That kind of
it's sort of subsided because people are moving elsewhere to the top of the cycle. It's a hotspot, and it only suits particular briefs. And people are looking to anticipate moving to other areas before they actually boom, because now everyone is chasing the next WA. So, and it's not actually appearing in most of the shortlist. If you filter for hotspots, you will get the Townsville, Kansas, and WA. If you filter for warm spots, you will get the Melbournes or Victorias of the world, So, what was it? Coming back to, you have to, coming back to the affordability question. Now, the reason why Townsville has grown for 8 years, 10% average, not allowing for compounding, is because the property was extremely affordable for the owner-occupier cohort as well as for the investor cohort. And it continues to be, by the way. Townsville is still a very affordable area, which is why it still has more steam. Now, in some WA areas that I looked at, they've grown substantially, have an ERSAT of 1 or 2, and affordability index that's extremely sitting in the unaffordable range. So I'm already seeing some hallmarks or signs of the lack of steam. And on top of that, if we layer further dramatic increase in the vacancy rates, we can sort of discern from that investor saturation. So it's sort of a few red flags. Right?
Yeah. Well, this is actually talking to Adam's question here. How do we get to know which cohort is predominantly buying in a particular suburb? Is there factors that tell us it's more owner occupier or more investor / renter? So what do you see? What do you see in the data for that type of?
So usually when you already have a hotspot, it's both cohorts. It's both cohorts competing for the asset. Now, what's the split? You can't determine that, but you can have a look at the vacancy rates trends. And if you see vacancy rates, both short-term and long-term vacancy rates increasing substantially, then you see a dominance of investors participating in the market. Now, usually the first cohort that starts purchasing property in any suburb is the owner-occupier cohort. And that's usually in the suburbs that are prior to them being hotspots, in suburbs that are cold spots or warm spots, if you will. What you usually see is, in areas that are moving and that are gaining momentum, you see affordability established, you see severe supply scarcity, and then what happens then, that small increases in owner-occupier demand actually lead to very material changes. And this causes a positive feedback loop, which is referred to as reflexivity in financial theory. So what happens is that growth incites more growth. So as owner-occupiers start participating, investors move to the market if it fits their budget, and then you see that substantial competition and above 10% average growth thereafter when it turns into a hotspot. So that's the usual relationship.
I guess one of the things, the questions I have is, what does a cycle look like? What is a typical cycle, and how does it typically flow out? Because I talk about, like we talk about property plans and property strategy, and it's generally like factored in. Well, the Australian market did 6.9% compounding, but in reality, it doesn't actually work. Like, how do you see cycles? How do you think about property?
Can I interject for a second? So, because one of my questions was going to be, we always talk about we're choosing suburbs based on the data, but then we'll talk about where it is in the cycle. But if you're just looking at the data, where it is in the cycle should have no weight whatsoever. Where I think that premise comes from, and correct me if I'm wrong, is obviously the growth is what changes the data, because it changes affordability numbers and it changes days on market and things like that. But we theoretically then shouldn't be talking about the previous growth. It should just be that data snapshot. Am I correct? Or tell me if I'm wrong. I'm keen to know.
Yeah. So your growth in the past doesn't. You're right. Growth in the past doesn't actually tell you where the area is in the cycle. So where the area is in the cycle depends. What I usually do is I usually account for factors that I can't control. So I can control the demand. Let's say 1,500 HSAC subscribers move into one area and they control the demand side of the equation. Now, what I usually do is I restrict the supply side of the equation. I make sure there's a severe supply scarcity established combined with high levels of affordability. Now, when I have that, and then I look at the last year growth and I see minus 3%, that's a warm spot, because I know that it hasn't gone to the 10%. Usually how I discern cycles, a good proxy to discern.
You said it again. I just missed what you said. It goes.
So if I have severe affordability established, severe supply scarcity established, and then I look at the last year growth, and I see minus 2%, I know, and then at that stage I might look even at previous growth just to see where it will be, like, has it actually peaked or is it coming down? And there's growth rate cycles on our platform as well, which show the growth rate of the particular area, whether it's at the bottom or at the top. But to, let's say, delineate a warm spot, it will be affordable area with severe supply scarcity that hasn't had substantial growth in the last year or last 3 years. So that will be a warm spot to go into a hot spot. And usually in those instances, where it's very affordable and severe supply scarcity, even small increases in demand start pumping that price to go past 5%, past 7%, and then past 10%. Now, hotspots, they can last anywhere between 1 to 6 years. I usually say 1 to 4. There are examples such as Townsville. I consider a hotspot anything that is plus 10% growth in the last year. And why I usually consider it's not an arbitrary number. I've sort of derived it from the ground behavior. When you usually see 15, 20 people bidding for the same house, it will be classified as a hotspot, and it's usually exemplified in last year growth. Now, to throw a spanner in the works, Melbourne, we see 30 people bidding for the same house, and yet it has seen maybe 2% growth.
Yeah.
So there's a price lag there. So what will happen is that Melbourne will pump quicker in a short time span, because the growth is actually lagging from on the ground behavior. So to go to Steve's comment,
why didn't it move? Why didn't it? There is tight supply, solid demand. There's 30 people at the door. Why did they not fight the price up?
Yeah, so I'm talking about an aggregated level on the Melbourne as a whole market.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So because that's it. You're not buying Melbourne. You're not buying, Windbow. You're buying whatever. Like, you're buying a property on a street in a
correct. So certain suburbs, because there are monthly data releases, certain suburbs will see percentage growth increasing in the last quarter, last month. You will see the movements. But what is interesting is that what I find is there's too many people bidding for the same home for the price change that's happening currently. So what you might expect very soon is a dramatic jump. Now, not in all of them, in some. So when you do it on an aggregated level, that's why I say plus 2% or 0, sitting at about that mark,
But being devil's advocate, you could theoretically have 30 people with a max budget of 700K and the property is going for 680 to 700K. There's not room to grow in that because you don't have the affordability.
Absolutely. It is an indication of sentiment of some sort, But it doesn't, you're right, it doesn't have to actually materialize, but it's a good indicator. Well, by the way, the houses are actually selling. Now they're selling above advertised price, but that's sort of expected for Melbourne because it's usually underquoting there, you know. And we see that regularly happening. But yeah, you're right, Steve, in a sense that there could be 30 people there, 25 are doing window shopping, you know.
I think what naturally happens is they migrate to the cheaper suburbs, and then the more expensive suburbs that the 750 people couldn't afford will then come in. So it's not just a simple, this is the suburb data you have to look at.
Yeah. Now, I usually, absolutely. I usually see when there's a lot of people showing up, taking time out of the day to show up, and out of those 30, maybe, 5 are bidding. It is a good sign. It is a good sign. It's definitely not a sign of a cold market.
Yeah,
let's put it that way. And if you already have, the good thing about Melbourne is they already have, Melbourne, GCC region is very affordable. It's extremely affordable, and there's a severe supply scarcity. And then yet you see on top of that, 20 or 30 people showing up to open homes. Well, something is, something is aligning.
You can see it. You can see something.
Elijah's just sort of asked a question that I kind of mentioned as well. Oh, there's another one coming from him about ripple effect as well, but we'll go this one first.
Yeah, well, no, well, it's just confirming exactly like what you're saying. It's not just necessarily about the data. You can jump onto the phone, pick up the call with the agent and say, "G'day, what's going on? How many owner occupiers are there? How many investors are there? Who's driving?"
Absolutely. What we have like from the ground subgroup in our mastermind where buyers agents usually post from open houses and like what has happened and all of that. And I have a lot of buyers agents from Melbourne as members who are saying that they're really struggling to actually obtain real estate now in Melbourne because especially the Sydney buyers agents are outbidding them sight unseen. Yeah. And that's really been, I've been getting messages from left, right, and center commenting that. So that's also an indication that something is happening and it's steaming up.
I want to take a bit of a shift now. I want to, one of the things that we wanted to hit onto was different types of brief and run out some real life brief examples for 1 to 2 areas. One of the areas that I want to hit was like a regional New South Wales or a New South Wales budget between 500 to 700K. Like where are the areas that stack up for that? And then anyone else in the comments, throw your brief out there based on those 4 variables. What are the 4 variables again, Matt?
So what is your budget, investment time horizon, when do you plan to extract equity into the subsequent purchase, and what is the risk profile? Now, what you did there, Joe, you inadvertently answered this 4 questions by putting us in New South Wales. So you're essentially saying that the equity extraction time frame is probably 4 or 5 years because New South Wales regional will not become a hotspot, will not become a hotspot in prior to that. So this is why I always say we'll definitely look at that. But when you imposing an area, you're inadvertently answering portions of the brief.
Yeah. Okay, sweet. Well, throw them in the comments. We're going to run the ad for the beautiful Steve Palise, and then we'll jump on it. Oh, sorry. Did I just swear? Sorry.
Oh, Jeff, I wish there was 3 investing books that covered everything property.
Oh, Joe, there is. Steve has 3 books now.
That I do, guys. I've got 3 books now. You probably don't even have to follow this group anymore. Just kidding. You want to keep seeing and hearing from me, of course, so stay involved. But in all seriousness, if you want to get the full picture of investing, residential, commercial, and development, these 3 books have you covered for the fundamentals. For OzProp members, here's the best part. I'm giving these books to you for free. Just cover the postage and I'll send them right to your door. Go to paliseproperty.com or click the link below and get your copies today. You can also get all my spreadsheets, checklists, and resources free on my website. Happy reading, gang.
That's ridiculous.
That's really cool. I like that.
Yeah,
that was the first time I played that one. That was the new one we did this week.
Yeah, I think the brief was like, how do we humiliate Jeff and Joe the most and sell some books? We should give away some books.
Well,
that's cool, man. You've got the development book out now. So, like, development's pretty big and complex and scary. Is it?
Yeah.
Is it explained simply in the book?
Yeah, I've had Lamb kind of. It's the The good thing is because you don't have to explain all the fundamentals of resi and commercial because of it, because I've got the 2 other books. So it's kind of like a referral on top of that. So it means it didn't have to be such a big, beefy book. I didn't have to explain what a duplex is and what a house and granny flat is and yada, yada. So it's just the cool development stuff. But the whole purpose of this is I got sick of people being like, he's the commercial guy. No, I'm the buy the right property for you guy. The same as Matt, use the data that applies to you the most guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's it. It depends on where you are in the cycle, right? Like if you've got the, well, I guess you're going to learn in the development book, like there are buyers agents out there that go out there and find, negotiate, secure deals. And then there's developer agents, like called developers, that do the same thing, but help you with the development where, great, I need to make 200, I've got, 300 grand of cash. I want to double that. How do I do that? Well, it's probably going to be in a development, but there is also high risk and high reward associated with that. I guess.
Steve, do you manage the whole development process for people, or?
So we offer both the sourcing and the management as well.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Right.
Right. You do the QS part, everything, PM work,
everything full end to end, everything, and anything we don't know, we'll introduce you to someone who obviously does it better than us.
Yeah, I was a QS in my last life, and I work for developers, so that's what I'm asking.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
You didn't know that.
Well,
that's
we'll
cool.
refer to Matt.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's funny. I was working with numbers my whole life, but I was very bad at mathematics. It's weird. It's ironic.
Okay, cool. Well,
I was really good at mathematics and got 99.5 in high school, but I like doing simple numbers now.
So sorry, Joe, not to take it away from you. I'm just interested now, genuinely. You used to do civil in your previous, or you used to work
I did robot mechatronics. So I used to design like robotic limbs and hospital machines. Then I got into mining designing. So I'm actually a chartered structural mechanical design engineer by trade.
Okay, all right. Smart cooking. All right, no worries. No, because structural, that's one of the highest paying jobs and one of the hardest degrees to get anyway. So yeah.
Really,
yeah.
Okay, right, well let's talk about brief. Has anyone thrown in their brief in the comments? Well, okay, well maybe let's do this. What is so I've got 500K. I'm obviously, if I'm buying
500 to what? 500 to what? 500 is the limit, the ceiling?
500, 700. Ceiling's the 700 range. And I've got that, and I'm not in a rush. I don't need a hotspot. I want like what's going to be the hottest market that I can get into, because it already is quite, subdued at the moment.
Let's go with my mum and dad client who aren't trying to extract equity in the next 3 years. They want just a good, sturdy investment. Next day, they put out a bit of equity. They just want a good 10-year performer.
Yeah, so good. Now, that's fine. Now, the fact that they don't want to extract equity doesn't mean that they shouldn't consider the short-term to mid-term performance of the area. Why? Because if the area is performing good in the short to mid-term, they're increasing their long-term averages inadvertently. So you should still consider the performance of the area at every stage. Now, what I would do, I'll start presenting.
Yeah. By the way, one thing, I guess we will run yet another ad. We've just released a course, Oz Property Investors, with Matt. Is actually everyone on this call is a big part of this. We have just released the Oz Property Investor course called Level Up Property, where we talk through all of this that we've just covered off so far with Matt, and how to do it all yourself, and how to make the process of going out there and buying an investment grade property like a buyer's agent. You can absolutely go out there and do this, as long as you've got all the tools, resources, and all that good stuff. But you do get a free 6-month subscription with Matt as well, going through the entire platform. I know we're going to go through it now, but there's a lot more. There's a lot more to it. We are also giving away 20 golden tickets. And what is a golden ticket? A golden ticket is Jeff and I reviewing the deal that you find and accepting it or rejecting it based on as if we were buying it for ourselves. So anyone that wants that, levelupproperty.com.au.
That's very good practice, man.
I think you've also got me, Joe, to review any commercials they find as well.
I might take you up on that, boys.
Hey, and we got a golden ticket from Palise. There you go. I need to.
And can I make you an ad for the Oz Prop?
No, you don't get it. Yes, actually, you can. If you're going to make us one like that, but your head is get Matt's head doing the same thing.
Let me make an ad for Oz Prop session so it can be my ad and then your ad. All right.
That's funny. Yeah, we want them to sing together. Oh, this is Steve. Steve did this one. Oh, okay. What are we doing? What are we talking about? Sorry,
All right,
guys.
should I share the screen? Am I sharing screen?
Yeah. Yeah. Hit the share button, and then I'll. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Now I'm going to add
Is
it
it sharing?
to the
It is.
stage. I can. Yes, we're sharing your full screen. You can see H tab.
So what are we doing a particular location or just AU wide?
Okay. Do AU wide because that's the smart move. Like the dumb move is saying, oh, I have to buy in New South Wales. Now, when would you say I need to buy in New South Wales? When your land tax thresholds are starting to really affect your portfolio performance, right? Like if you've got, but yeah, to be honest, it should be.
But only if you think you're going to get a better return plus that land tax component in that area. Otherwise, you're still in a net negative.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
it's like when people talk about Victoria. Oh, there's land tax. It's like $1,100. That's fine. You'll make that.
Yeah, and sometimes we have a lot of clients that, let's say, own occupiers who will down the track turn it into an investment property, and because they want to live in it first, they want to buy, I guess, the best location in the proximity. In that instances, you might be narrowing the area further. But in many other instances is, the best way is to let the data speak and not have any bias about the areas. Now, what I usually do is, you see, I'm not going to go through details about the platform and all the buttons that I click. I think it's unnecessary. I'll just talk about the main thing here. So we'll set the budget between 500 and 700. I usually enable the bedroom filter just to, I guess, again, cast a wider net, because what might happen is we might find a phenomenal suburb that has a typical price for four bedder at 780. But if we enable the 3-bedroom filter, we might be able to afford a 3-bedroom home within that suburb. And it's a great suburb.
Completely.
So that's why I didn't click any location. So I unchecked that. SA4 regions also left unchecked. Now, what you see is essentially the essential checklist that you need to have. And as I mentioned before, and this essentially relates to the answers to the 4 questions. Now, the 4 questions and how you answer them corresponds back to the data that you layer and then you include. So first one is budget. Second one is data confidence. And data confidence we usually relate to, I would always allow for it and I will always set it at high, but he speaks about question number 2 and question number 4. What is your investment time frame and what is your risk profile? And if it's long-term and low, your data confidence needs to be high. Does that make sense?
Long-term and low. Okay, that makes sense.
So if your answer to question 2 is my investment time frame is long, i.e. 10 years, and answer to number 4 inadvertently would be my risk profile is low, that implies that you have to have high data accuracy, because the more you go into the future, the more certainty you bring upon yourself. So you can't have flimsy or oscillating data sets upon which you're making a decision. The third thing that I do, again, I account for risk.
Just on that confidence, at what point would I want to have when would I accept a medium or low confidence? Like at what point would I
would never accept a low confidence area.
Okay. So how many suburbs are there in Australia? Like there must be 15,300 and then...
There's 15,300 suburbs and we have 6,500 suburbs on our platform, because all of the other suburbs do not even have sufficient sales to be classified as low confidence, which means that out of those 6,500, they're further segregated into high, medium, and low. Now, I don't have the number handy, how many of in each of them are, but this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to increase the probability, which means that we need to be looking at things that will produce us or give us what we want. This is why it's a funnel-like approach with everything, even with the number of suburbs.
Okay, I'm going to shut up and let you run this sucker.
All good. So, ask, because I might be saying things that I totally think make sense, but maybe they're not making sense. So, the third thing that I do, and I always say to people, you have to account for risk. Now, we have an RCS risk score. That's just a fancy algorithm that does what I mentioned before. Checks industry centralization, exposure to negative environmental effects, low hold periods, high rent-to-owner ratios, etc. But the 4 main domains that it looks at is industry diversification index, dominance of mining and agriculture, bushfire and flooding index. They have the highest weighting in this score. And as I mentioned before, I cast a wider net and I say greater than equal to 50. RCS score is a score between 1 and 100. So if I say greater than equal to 50, I'm eliminating all of those. So the higher the score, the better, which means that I'm eliminating all of those areas that have above average inherent risk. Make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. So for this price point, because we're going to 700K, as a ceiling. You see that affordability index is not sitting at 30, it's not sitting at 35. I moved it to 40. Now my preference, so it's less than equal to 40. Now for the listeners, our affordability index takes into account a few things. So it's medium income within a particular suburb. 50% of the income goes to the repayments of the house on an 80-20 LVR. We take into account current cash rate plus 2% buffer and the typical price. Okay, so there's a few levels. That's why it's an index, and it's much more contextual on a suburb level. So I set the index at less than equal to 40. Now, as I said before, I'm casting a wider net, but my preference, if I could find perfection, I would like to invest in an area that's 700K with an index of 35 and below. But for the time being, I'm just trying to eliminate the noise, produce a short list, and then further in detail comparison, I'll assign higher significance to metrics that are very important, such as affordability, to make sure that I put those that are performing great in those domains at the forefront of the list. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. So the next thing that I do, number 4, and this is what I call, if you go confidence, risk, affordability, and NERSAD, which is socioeconomics, I call them as macro factors. Now, they're not macro, they're just necessary for nearly every brief. Because we're touching the ceiling of 700K, we need to include socioeconomics. Now, NERSAD is a score from 1 to 10. 1 and 2 are classified as disadvantageous. 3 to 7 are classified as neutral. And 8, 9, and 10 are classified as opportunistic. Now, as you see, I don't actually, when I'm researching, I don't go and I say, okay, I want the NERSAD to be at 8, and I set it at 8. If I do that, I'm restricting the database too much in the results, because perfection, as I said before, does not exist.
But it is a good indication, though. If you're saying that the top end of town, like 8 is a massive number, and you're a suburb that's at a max 700, and you're sneaking into that, surely it's like, oh shit, this is a very affordable level 8 area that's crushing it. If there's only 2 or 3,
for the people that just jumped on, do you want to explain NERSAD again?
So NERSAD is an index of socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage. And NERSAD is an index because ABS, it's an ABS metric published by ABS, and they take into account 20 or 30 indicators. So it's a very robust indicator that essentially speaks to the socioeconomic standing of a particular suburb. And they produce it as a score between 1 to 10. 10 being very affluent and socioeconomically advantageous, 1 being very disadvantageous. So, Joe, to what you said, yes, correct, that is the case. However, again, there are other metrics that follow thereafter, which are also very significant. And if we include too rigid of a score now, we might produce areas that have, yes, they have the good affordability, good socioeconomics, but they have very bad supply and demand.
Yeah.
And what might happen is that an area that has an index of 6 was eliminated, and yet they have great supply and demand dynamics.
Yeah.
So
you're missing out on all the other areas you could have been looking at that had better.
Correct. So this is why ranges are important. We need to understand which ranges we should not look at under any circumstance, and which ranges we can accept if everything else is good. So that's why there's a bit of a trade-off. That's why filtering is essentially a process of eliminating noise, and you're not done once you finish the filtering. You still need to go through a process of detailed comparison. So I set it at greater than equal to 3, essentially allow for all the neutral and advantageous areas. I'll give you an example. Karoom Downs in Melbourne has a typical price of 750, has a NERSAD of 3, which to me, it's sort of not perfect, not great. I would like it to be higher, and yet has phenomenal metrics in all the other domains. So that's what I'm trying to say. You have these areas that in some areas they lack a little in some domains, but in others they exceed everyone else. Which is why you have to be careful how you set the ranges, And then when I satisfy the macro filters, then I go into the micro. Now, it's not actually micro, but I go as close to the purchase point as possible, or what is happening on the ground when it comes to the suburb level. And I go into restricting the supply side of the equation. As I said before, I restrict the supply.
So why do you start with supply? Why is supply the first metric that you look at?
Yeah, supply is first metric that I look at, especially if you're trying to anticipate things. So now what we have to realize is that these metrics are not in isolation stated here. They all speak to each other. So I've first listed the affordability, then I listed the socioeconomics, then I restrict the supply. All of the things that I can't supply, I can't control. Even if I'm a developer, I can't control the supply side of the equation. While demand, you have big buyers agents that are buying 100 properties a month. They can control the demand side. And it's all good and well to control the demand side, and you can be controlling the demand side, but you're not going to see any growth. The supply is rampant within that area. So I first restrict and address what I can't control.
Do you want to, for the viewers, just explain the terms all you've got? So you got SOMLS, SOM percentage, just go through that.
Yeah, I will. I'll go into that. Now, what is important about restricting the supply is that you need to restrict the supply across various time domains. So it's like, this is like a temporal representation of supply. And what do I mean by that? Stock on market percentage is current levels of supply. Inventory is essentially has its average months of supply, which means it has a historical element to it. Building approval ratio is future supply of new dwellings. Hold periods is distant future supply of existing dwellings. Okay, so I'm trying to restrict the supply at every point into the future, whether it's current, midterm, short-term, and long-term future, to make sure that it's restricted across all domains, which increases the probability, if combined in unison with good socioeconomics and higher levels of affordability, it increases the probability of actually turning that warm spot into a hot spot. So I'm just setting the scene. I'm making sure that everything is ready, that I allow for all of the essential metrics, and then I go deeper thereafter. So going into the acronyms, now, another thing that's important, and this is what we started the discussion with this topic about significance. We are in the game, property investment is a game of prediction. And in order for us to predict, we have to understand what will happen in the future by nature of the definition, I guess. So the best way to understand what will happen in the future is to analyze the trends of certain metrics. Because, again, as I said, the illiquidity of the asset. You don't see sporadic changes in trends, especially trends that are of high confidence, high data accuracy. So trends are more important than current values when it comes to predicting, which is why they carry a higher significance. So this is why people go wrong when they assign the same significance to every metric, when inadvertently the trend will give you more information about what will happen in the future than if I gave you the current stock on market for this month.
Yeah. Which is where a lot of buyers agents go wrong when they come into the market, is they're like, oh, look at this suburb. I found vacancy rates of this. This is this. Supply days on market of this. And that's all they present, which means nothing in isolation.
It is one-dimensional. It doesn't actually say anything. Now, I started property investing by looking, and the reason why hashtag started is because I was looking at your investment property, or my investment property magazine, I forget now, and they used to publish it monthly, and at the end of at the back of each publication,
like the only metric.
you used to have metrics for each month. And then I used to think, okay, but I can't really discern what's going to happen in the future because I don't have the trends. And that's when we started thinking about it. So now, when it comes to the hierarchy of significance, long-term trends are more forceful than short-term trends, and short-term trends are more forceful than current values. So they inadvertently should carry a different weighting when we're trying to predict results. Okay? So this is why I include stock on market long-term trend first. By the way, guys, we have like 100 metrics or more. But I only include some that are necessary, because when you overburden the database with too many requests, you're not going to get any results. Because the database is essentially monolith structure, so you have to play with them, accordingly. So I include what is necessary. In that instance, I'm not going to include the short-term trends. I first initially include only the long-term trend for the stock on market because it's more forceful, and I set it at less than zero. Zero means an equilibrium line, so essentially nosediving. I don't set it at too forcefully nosediving. I just set it at less than zero. Later in the detailed comparison, I'll make sure that delineate those that have a more forceful downtrend, which equates to a more severe supply scarcity. The second thing that I do, I set the current stock on market at less than 1.5%. Now, the reason why I include the current value for the stock on market and not for inventory, because when we did a correlation analysis, stock on market is more tied to predicting growth, or is more correlated to growth than is inventory. Now, they are very close metrics, but stock on market is edging a little when it comes to significance. So I set the current stock on market value for this month at less than 1.5. And then what I did prior to that, I made sure that it's declining. So I'm essentially connecting it to a low point as well. I'm making sure inadvertently that the decline in the stock on market is actually touching a semi-low point of 1.5%. Okay.
Yeah. So what that means is, like, stock on market is literally how many properties are on the market. So if there's 100 people like properties in this area, there's only one available in the market to be 1%. So that's quite a low amount of stock.
So the percentage is in response to number of dwellings. Yes, it's a ratio essentially. So how much stock there is in response to the number of dwellings, which makes it much more contextual. If I gave you, there's 3 properties in one area and then there's 70 in another. What if the first area has a population of 1,000 and the other has, 3 million? You know what I mean? So the other one, the area number B, is better in percentage terms as a ratio. So looking at the number of stock on market currently is meaningless if you don't actually convert it into a ratio. It's much more contextual as a ratio. The next thing that I do, I look at inventory long-term slope, as you see, as well. I set it at less than 0. Now, for the building approval ratio, Steve has mentioned that it's a mum and dad's kind of mum and dad investor who's not looking to extract equity. That's all good. I still want to make sure that these investors are investing in an area that have potential in the short term so they can increase their long-term averages. And now when it comes to building approvals, I'm interested in the current levels of building approvals, because the current levels of building approvals, as Steve knows, 1 to 3 years to materialize into a dwelling, depending on what you're building. So that means that if the current building approval is high, in the next 2 years, that will materialize into supply. And if the demand doesn't meet those appropriate levels of newly introduced supply, the price will either stagnate or decline. So this is why the short-term, the future short-term supply are restricted by making sure that the building approvals are in the neutral to opportunistic range, and I set it at less than 1.5%. Now, the last one that I did as a temporal, I guess, to finalize that temporal discussion of supply, is I make sure that the hold periods are high enough to fit at least bottom end of one cycle, general consensus of a cycle. General cycle is between 7 to 10 years in property. Now, the larger cycle, there are mini cycles within. So I set it at the lower end of 7 years, because usually in Australia, you don't have a lot of properties that have hold periods 10, 15, 20 years. It's very rare. So I don't want to set it at too high or too rigid again, because I'll reduce my shortlist too much. But I want to set it at a very good level, because hold periods, not only is it future supply of existing dwellings coming to the market, in this instance every 7 years, because I set it at greater than equal to 7, which includes 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. But it's also a livability metric, in a sense that it's a sentiment metric about the area, because if people, and this is what I always say to people, every metric that you introduce, you have to consider it as a reflection of some kind of behavior. You have to think about it in behavioral terms. What does this inform? What does this represent or reflect on the ground? So what would hold periods, high hold periods, represent on the ground? Well, people like to live in that area, Essentially, they want to reside in the area. There's a sentiment about the area, and that's essential for that area to have long-term appeal when it comes to both its residents and inadvertently the growth that it generates. So what I did here now is I've addressed the macro aspect, which are necessary respected to the price points as well as the ranges, and then I restricted the supply. Now, my job doesn't end here. However, we have 110 entries, yeah? We have 100. Now, some of the entries are repeating because I've enabled the bedroom filter. Now, what you might see in these lists, you might see hot spots, warm spots. You'll see any type of the area. Now, regarding our brief, we have to consider at which position within the cycle do we want to enter in response to our brief, yeah? So if it's mum and dad investor that are not interested in extracting equity immediately, my suggestion to them would be to enter into a warm spot. And a warm spot can last anywhere between 1 to 4 years, in the same way that a hot spot can last anywhere between 1 to 4 years. And warm spots are usually classified as areas that are generating anywhere between, -7, -5 to +5, +7% growth, yeah? And you have those transitioning areas in between warm and hot when they between 7 and a 10. So while
we're missing comparing, so then if it's not a mum and dad investor and it's a 25-year-old first property, short-term horizon, what are the key data points you're changing or looking at based on that?
I'm not changing anything here. I'm just adding one thing, which is used as a great proxy to delineate position in the market cycle, and that will be last year growth.
Right.
So that will be so I would go price change in the last year. And I would say, or you can do price change in the last 3 years. Pick a time frame that's sort of short term, but I go with 1 year. Now, as I said, there's a lot of analysis that comes thereafter to ascertain, you know, which suburb is best. But a good proxy for me would be, for example, if the person wants to maximize growth in the first couple of years, if they want an equity extraction time frame of 2 years, that's a hotspot. They need a hotspot, which means that area needs to be generating 10% plus growth in the next 2 years minimum. Yeah. So a hotspot is an area that it's already generating about 10%. So if I can pinpoint the actual location, do I want an area that's transitioning? Maybe better one that's transitioning, because if I enter a hotspot, when I say transitioning between warm and a hot is sitting at around 7% annual growth in the last year. It's not too rampant of a hotspot, which would potentially allow me to enter a source real estate, because an everyday investor who tries to enter hotspots without a buyer's agent, it will prove very difficult because they don't have established relationships with sales agents. And they'll find it very hard to find an asset. I see that every day. So I always advise, okay, move a bit before in the cycle. And instead of, let's say, 2 years for an equity extraction, wait 2.5 or 3, but that will provide you with more opportunity to actually find an asset in an area that you want. So what I would do in that instance, I would say, okay, set the price change in the last year between, let's say, 5 and 12 to delineate the transition. Yeah. So now for the client who wants to maximize equity within the next 2 years, I want an area that's sitting maybe closer to the 12, but I've set a range, again, because of lack of perfection in a data set. I've just set a range to make sure that it's not too warm. He doesn't have to wait for 4 years, but it's not too hot at the same time, which would prove it difficult for him to find an asset within a particular suburb. So does that make sense?
Yeah. It makes sense. Like, because that's where I think a lot of people go wrong, is they go into a market and they're like, oh, great, this is a hotspot. That's great. That's what I want. But it's like, well, shit, you can't buy there. So you're going to really struggle. And then you're going to be chasing it for 6 months. And then you've just lost 6 months worth of value because you haven't been able to negotiate a good enough deal because you haven't got the relationship. So you're not, you're chasing that. Also, the other challenge with a hotspot is the market moves incredibly quick. So the comparables are challenging. So you're going to be looking back at the last 3 months of sales and be like, well, this one was 500. This one should be 502. But in reality, it's more like 510 or 500.
You would have experienced that quite a lot, Joe, when we're buying, say, Adelaide, and we buy something for 550, and they're like, why are we paying 550? This one's sold for 525. This one's sold for 515. You're like, that's exactly why we're buying.
Exactly.
And deals that I regret not buying is just ridiculous.
Yeah, why am I paying your buyer's agent fee to pay more than they were selling 2 months ago? And I'm like, exactly.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And if you want a hotspot, for example, you can go for price change and you say greater than 10%. The issue with that is that within this data set, you also have suburbs that are generating 25 and 30. So you can nuance it further and say, okay, I want it to be between, in the last year, 10 and 15. However, because that's so close, you might be narrowing your database too much. And I'm always an advocate of anticipation. You know, it's better to come in a bit earlier than to enter a rampant hotspot to be able to actually source the asset, because it's all good and well to delineate a great suburb, but in order for you to make money, you have to be able to buy an asset within that location. Yeah. And when it's a slugfest within an area such as Townsville or Mackay now, it's going to prove extremely hard to do that. So
there's a great question that's come up here. Are there any duds that only grow 7% and then their trend goes down the next year and they become a not spot? Like they've never become a hot.
No, it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because of everything that we discussed prior.
Now, if you're looking at all the other metrics.
Yeah, like the linear line and stuff, yeah.
Not only that, but also because property is in liquid. You don't see jumps. You don't see jumps and then declines within a year, and that like that all the time. It's not like what's the thing that shows the heart? The PQR, whatever it is. It's not like that. You know, everything moves in cycles, and cycles are mini cycles. You have the large cycle, 7 to 10 years, or 16 or whatever, and then you have mini cycles.
I think that's the beauty of property investing. And that's why this data becomes so valuable, because you can see, it's like, the way I think about it is a large moving ship, like one of those shipping containers. If you want to turn that sucker, it's going to take you minutes, 20, 30, 40 minutes to get that thing around. And it's the same with the property market, but it's so slow. You can kind of keep on top.
Exactly. Exactly. That's the beauty of it. And to answer the gentleman's question, if it was a gentleman, I'm not sure. I can't actually see.
Yeah.
If the area is growing substantially in value and at the same time has established supply scarcity and affordability, it will continue to grow. Because you have affordability established. Sorry?
Yeah. So where are these hotspots? You're getting me excited now, mate.
No, these are the transition.
I think it was Elijah's point about the 7% drop. The only time you could even possibly get that is if a major macro factor changed. And what I meant by that was people buying in a mining town, and then the mine, all of a sudden there's an announcement saying we're closing next year. And then that might cause over a year. I can only think of something major like that would cause it.
No, absolutely. But I think what the question was, that area where the mine is closed, it wasn't only growing for 1 year. It was growing substantially. Yeah. Because investment, as you know, investment in a mine is a decade process.
Yeah.
You know, infrastructure and everything. So it was growing
for a living.
Sorry?
I used to design mine sites for a living.
Yeah. So I mean, it's not something that comes to fruition within a year. The area pumps and then people go. It doesn't happen that way. It's a slower process. So once we come to this stage and we have a particular, let's say shortlist delineated, we have to go further and do a detailed comparison. Now, guys, I can talk about this for hours, but I just want to, for the viewers, and this is where it comes to, we use Dex, for example. You have Dex Lite and Dex Pro. Dex Lite has 33 metrics. Dex Pro has 100 metrics, yeah? Now, you can compare areas from 100 different domains, okay? So we've now delineated a short list on the basis of this, which relates to our brief. Now we have to go further and do a detailed comparison by assigning significance to each and every metric on the basis of what we're trying to achieve. Now, every metric has a hierarchy, and the hierarchy is driven by its correlation to producing growth or cash flow, whatever we're investing under. Not only that, every metric has a timestamp associated with it. It has a short-term, mid-term, and long-term timestamp. So you need to go, for example, when you're doing a detailed comparison, you need to compare all of the shortlisted suburbs across metrics that you want to compare against, but you need to assign significance or weighting scores to metrics that align with your brief. I want to give you an example. If I'm purely for the growth play, I'm purely interested in growth, I'm not going to even consider yield. I'll give it a 0. Or I'll give it a 1 or 2. But if I'm interested in growth, I'll give a return on investment high and low. I'll give it a high mark to introduce a larger disparity, because yields and growth work in an inverse relationship. When one is growing, the other one is not growing so much. It is very rare that we see pumps in both substantially, because it doesn't work that way. Essentially, yield is a factor of the price and vice versa.
Yeah. It can't be, the rent can't move.
Correct. So, which means that if you're comparing, this is what I always say to people, if you're comparing multiple areas across many domains, you have to consider what is important for you and what you're trying to achieve. Because if you compare everything, imagine I assign a score of 5 to everything, that's the same as if I even didn't do the comparison. Because I'm completely...
Say that again.
If I'm assigning a weighting of 5 or weighting of 1 or a 10 to everything, that means I'm not nuancing what is important. It's the same as me not doing the comparison at all, because I'm nullifying everything.
Yeah, okay. Yep, okay.
I'm giving it the same significance. So I need to go...
Yep.
Correct. So nothing is exaggerated in terms of the outcome that I'm trying to achieve. So now, a lot of listeners might not be familiar with our platform, and there are a lot of metrics. I think about 50 metrics that we produce, actually proprietary to HTAG, like GRC index and GRC minima. And there's a long explanation that I will have to go into to explain these metrics, but they're essentially long-term indicators. But it is our job as researchers to go in and assign those metrics that are significant to layer 1 with high weightings, those that are less significant or layer 2 with a little bit less of a weighting, and those that are layer 3 with the least weighting, okay? To be able to nuance that, which is really important. And also, we also have to look at the time span of what is short-term, what is long-term, what is mid-term, which means that if I really want to generate growth in the short term, and I also want the long-term performance in the area, then I'm focusing on LT and MT and ST metrics, short-term, for ST, LT for long term. And I'm assigning significances accordingly. And once you do that, we have a cheat sheet at the bottom essentially. And this cheat sheet is essentially a correlation analysis that's done by an algorithm. But so people don't think that, you know, there's something under the hood that they don't understand, I'll do a thought exercise essentially. So imagine if I came to you and I said, Joe, what can you tell me about the potential short-term and long-term performance of the area if I just given you that the area has seen 7% growth in the last year? You can't really say anything.
No.
Because you're looking at an isolated metric. Now, if I came to you and I said the ERSAT of the area, we're looking at ERSAT in isolation only. The ERSAT of the area is 9. You can definitely tell me more about its long-term and short-term potential than just been looking at the last year growth. So that's essentially a simple thought exercise. This is why some metrics are more important than our affordability index is a very important metric because of the disparity between medium incomes and property prices. And that's why from the affordability perspective, you can always discern more from an area than, you know, from a rental increase potential, you know. So, but that essentially is done by the algorithm. Algorithm does those calculations in response to price growth and produces a hierarchy. And the hierarchy actually makes sense when you really look at it. For example, supply and demand metrics are all level 1 metrics, and they're all short to midterm metrics because essentially growth is supply scarcity plus increasing demand. That's one-on-one economics. There's nothing more to growth than that. And that's why it's a level 1 metric. So when you're doing a detailed comparison, as I said, or when you're trying to find areas, you first need to produce a research algorithm that aligns with your brief. And as I said before, we have, you know, 9 different strategies populated here. And as Steve has mentioned before, there are different variations to that you can tweak, which is why all of these can be tweaked. You can change it on the basis of what you're really trying to achieve. Once you construct a research algorithm and you eliminate noise, then you have to go a step further and actually assign significance to every metric in response to what you're trying to achieve, which is what produces very tailored and nuanced results. If you and I go through these decks and we assign different significances to metrics, we'll get two shortlists that are arranged in a different manner.
Yeah.
This is why a hotspot. This is why a hotspot for me is not a hotspot for you.
Mm.
Even sometimes if we have the same budgets, let alone if we don't have the same budgets.
I'm just cautious of time because we're getting on. Well, we've hit our time limit, but I do want to give the people the actual suburbs that we've gotten through here. We also have a discount code, I think, for Oz Property Investor members. I think it's 25% off of this platform to be able to get access to this. So if you guys do want to play around with that, jump on. But what are some of the hotties? What are the spotties? Give us the goods.
So you have the Canberra. So most of it is see. There's New South Wales, by the way, one of them, which is interesting. Then you have, and I need to inspect the actual area further. Now, if I click on the expert, you see only 15 metrics here. If I click on expert, you get all of the 100, and you'll see the extent that you can go through to actually analyze the areas appropriate. Like, for example, you go across. Now, this is what I say. I'd say to people, don't look at the table and don't look at the color coding. There is a lot there. Dex helps you take care of all of that, you know. Now, what we have is we have Ipswich, Cairns, New South Wales, and New South Wales, which is, So we have Ipswich, Cairns, and New South Wales in this shortlist. And we have only 11 areas, or actually less areas because some are repeating, that fit this particular brief. Now, remember that we've really delineated the transitioning stage when it comes to the market cycle. And I said at 5 to 12, I was very specific. Now, if I take that away, for example, and I work with everything that I have, I'll get 110 entries. So see how I'm funneling down to actually particularly what I want. So sometimes, I mean, a good shortlist is a shortlist that 10 to 15 properties. But sometimes we're very specific about our brief. We might get not 10 to 15 properties, 10 to 15 areas. We might, if we're very specific, we might get 3 or 4. That's not a bad thing. And by the way, there's 3 or 4 from the entire Australia. And what I usually suggest to people, look for real estate in all 4. Don't focus on the top one. This is where the suburb analysis and the appeal of the actual asset plays a dominant role, because you might find a great asset in area number 3 on the list, which might perform better holistically than if you find a really bad asset and overpay for it in area number 1.
As you
And it
mentioned
gives-
before as well, the street and location and style of house and age of the build and its type of build, etc. That's all
Correct. Correct. And this is why the funneling up like approach is beautiful in a sense that it gives you the appropriate shortlist. And when you get the appropriate shortlist, look for real estate in the top 5. You're not going to go wrong.
Yeah.
That's top 5 outside of the entire Australia, which refers back to the specificity of your brief. You can actually reverse engineer this and say, okay, I know why I got this. I got it because I restricted supply. I made sure the property is affordable. I made sure the socioeconomics are great. There's less risk and there's high data accuracy. You can't argue with that.
Yeah, try it. Yeah.
Do you ever
argument?
find, because you're so in the data, that like even you would get analysis paralysis? Because I imagine like clients and even buyers agents, like especially some of the ones that are just coming to this market because they've done the course and whatnot, get analysis paralysis? Or do you just kind of tell them, look, focus on these fundamentals first, then the next is to how you become an expert?
Yeah, so great question. I don't get paralysis analysis, not because I'm smart or anything else, because I follow a method.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the method that we always teach. There's a method to the madness and the ontological foundation behind all of the figures that you have to follow and understand, you know. And when you follow that method, and this is the method that we teach, you know, and it's available when you subscribe to an onboarding process, it's all provided to you. As some people have a steeper learning curve, some a shorter learning curve. People really understand what metrics are and its definitions. It's a much shorter learning curve, but essentially it's a learning curve of 1 week, irrespectively, or less, which is not substantial considering the outlay that you're making. But when you understand the methodology behind it, the underlying methodology, you can be very flexible and shift and change and adjust to any brief that you actually get. So, I mean, Steve, we have on our platform even support like Data Dictionary, which provides people with ranges. We have an onboarding process which tells them how to layer and why to layer. We've done a little snippet here, but they have a lot of resources there that they can actually refer to, which eliminates that paralysis analysis. Now, everyone who encounters something new, obviously there's this uncertainty element and apprehension about what you're encountering. But as I said, you know, when you follow the method, the penny drops fairly quickly.
You also remove most of the risk because you've crossed off most of the items. And I have to do the same thing for commercial. I can't remove it completely, but by doing my due diligence checks and checking the data, I've at least removed most of them.
Yeah,
absolutely. And it's important for buyers agents as well as for investors. Like, you need to be able to explain to yourself why you're investing in a certain area. And you need to have, there needs to be a logical argument there. If you don't have a logical argument, the argument there is because somebody said so. That's not a logical argument.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't work. And especially for buyers agents, like if you settle on an area and you have some clients some that are great, some that are difficult. I mean, I'm a difficult client in some instances. So it's not a bad thing. But what I'm saying is that you need to, I think what's missing and what I love about the way the industry is changing is this educational piece about the servicing of clients, you know? So the explanation bit and the educational piece really improve the trust levels that you actually have with your clients and the perception of your service. And if you understand the method and why you got to a certain conclusion, when you can explain it to someone, they really appreciate it. It's not only I bought them an asset, you actually taught them something.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I think this has been I like to listen to podcasts on like 1.2, 1.5% speed. I think I'm going to not this one. Yeah.
This one 0.5 of how fast Matt talks.
Slow it down. Understand your concept. Go back and re-listen to it again, and then because everything he said so far that I've heard makes nothing but logical sense. And then, but then you're like, whoa, there's another good high value point here. Shit, I wasn't ready for that. Knocking them.
Thanks, guys. Yeah,
this has genuinely been my favorite one so far. Like I've actually learned something. Normally I'm just going with the flow of it, but this has been unreal, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Appreciate the compliment. Thanks a lot. Yeah, sometimes I'm not aware of, and I do speak fast, and I usually talk about this. And obviously, there are people with different levels of exposure and stuff. So I apologize to anyone. If anyone wants to ask me questions, you can just hit me up.
That's all. I always get told I speak fast because I'm passionate about it. And the more
same. I even got red in the face, and I'm waving my hands.
What about the hotspots, Joe?
Are we doing the hotspots?
Sorry,
your show, mate.
No, let's wrap it up. If anyone wants the hotspots, they can learn how to do it all for themselves, so they can have all the hotspots. or you can rewind and take a screenshot of the hotspots that.
Or
that
just
Matt
come to
had.
Palise property. I'll call Matt, and then I'll charge a fee, and I'll do it for you.
That's a good. That's a good there. Yeah, that's a good process. It's a good. But if you want me, I can send you the spreadsheet. By the way, if you want.
Love it.
Just throw us
How do we get more? How do we get more
comments
Matt in our life, mate? How do we do that?
How do we get more Matt in our life? Well, you had enough, man. You're probably sick of me. Nah, man. I'm in my mastermind all the time in #mastermind. Whoever, like, you can join on a free membership as well. I do a lot of stuff there. I talk to you guys all the time as well. So, and plus I definitely insult a couple of people here and there online, so that they'll see me there as well when I do my posts. So they'll definitely find me. Facebook and Joe, Jeff, Steve, and Mastermind. That's essentially where I am mostly.
That's where hang out the most. Steve, thank you very much for co-hosting this one, mate. You've been a great person to have a face to look at while Matt is talking the entire time. But
I've never had to pay so much attention on one of these in my life. I normally just come like, oh, this is easy being a co-host. Just ask a few dumb questions. This I'm like staring at the screen trying to pay attention the whole time.
No, I'm going to ask a question.
Like,
Damn it!
when the teacher, like, hope the teacher doesn't ask me a question. I'm like, hope Matt doesn't ask me anything too complicated.
I know that feeling, man. I've been in that situation. I know that feeling. Don't worry about it.
Love it. Okay,
I appreciate it, guys. That's
reach out to H-Tag. We got the link in the comments there. Reach out to Palise Property. He is the man when it comes to the commercial space and now the development space and all of that good stuff. And guys, let's go out there. Let's go buy a property. Let's go buy it in a warm spot, a hot spot, or whatever suits your brief. See you later.
Yeah, but I just want to say before I go, thank you, Steve, for co-hosting and for asking the insightful questions. And Joe, thank you for having me. Take care, guys.
Stay well. Bye-bye. Realize I have to end it. No, Jeff.